How is it that the expansionary fiscal policy of Chavez's administration produced high economic growth rates during the initial years to be afterwards ineffective? Initially, the expansionary fiscal policies of Chavez's government led to an increase in government spending and therefore of overall aggregate demand. Given that government spending in one of the four components of aggregate demand, this moved the equilibrium between demand and supply further to the right of the graph, which increased GDP growth. After a time, inflation started rising because of the extra spending. Venezuela had strict currency controls which made it hard to acquire hard currency. When the oil boom ended and Venezuela couldn't acquire more foreign currency, they restricted even more their imports. Unwilling to devalue their currency, inflation kept rising and money lost value. This made it hard to acquire the materials the economy needed to produce goods or import them directly. Because of these controls and the inflation the expansionary fiscal policy had created, aggregate supply fell because companies were either unwilling to sell at their established prices or unable to acquire the necessary input to produce goods. Now, talking about fiscal deficit, it's clear that this type of deficit increases when the government starts to spend more money than what they really have. It is most common seen in contemporary governments like Venezuela, for example, which is facing extreme consequences in different areas and industries distributed around the country. Now, when these countries have higher numbers in spending than in revenue, that's when the government has to borrow money, commonly from central banks, or money also from foreign creditors. So actually, the Federal Reserve is creating even more money to keep the price of the government debt high, which is totally related to the deficit spending, which is causing inflation. Now, talking about capital flight. It was the year 2000 when the capital flight in the Venezuelan economy reached record high. Certainly, this capital flight was due to political and economical instability alongside with currency depreciation. But the main reason that investors gave as for repatriating profits of transferring assets to the offshore banks and economies was the imposition of capital controls. Basically, since that time, there has been no openness in the Venezuelan market, creating a huge lack of confidence in the investors' minds. Nationalization. Aggregate supply is made up of goods and services that firms are willing to produce at a given time. When those firms don't see any profit in producing an increased output, or are unable to do so because of lack of technology or inputs, then aggregate supply will decrease. Nationalization and lack of property right reduce the incentive to do so. With Venezuela doing this and maintaining low prices even when costs rise, aggregate supply will decrease because firms will be unable to produce less goods. Potential GDP will also be diminished, or in the best case scenario stay static. This is because under the risk of nationalization, which there will be no incentive to invest in capital investments and infrastructure because it is highly likely that you might be deprived of anything you might invest in one day, and so the supply and potential GDP will suffer because of nationalization. There are many factors in which makes Mexico and Venezuela coincide. On one side, we have corruption, that the main reason for Perez to be removed from the position, and also many cases like Duarte. Economic regulations, as seen Peña Nieto did with the gasolinazo, which created a lot of polemic, and control of prices, which is affecting the living of many since most of the population lives in poverty. To conclude, initially economic growth during the early years of Chavismo in Venezuela was only possible because of the oil boom, which allowed Venezuela as one of the greatest producers of oil to spend without strategy and abandonment. Once that external income dried up and oil prices tumbled, the actual effect of populist policies were finally felt. With high inflation, currency controls, and economy exclusively reliant on oil exports and in need of imports for the majority of its consumption, Venezuela has found itself unable to cover its own needs. Controlled prices and a devalued currency, as well as nationalization, have destroyed private production and economic growth. Inflation brought on by the expansionary fiscal policy and monetary policy of the government have destroyed living standards. This case emphasizes Mexico's need for further diversification and to reject the short-term benefits of populist policies given their strong and negative long-term implications. With the current rise of populism in Mexico and the world, the country must realize the ease which an economy can destroy with these policies and avoid choosing similar leaders if it is not to follow Venezuela's path.